Hi everyone, I'm Rudolph ROGLY, PhD student at Saclay in France, and I will speak today on behalf of the Stereo collaboration and present the latest results of the Stereo experiment. But first of all, let me thank all the organizers of the WIN 2021 conference for allowing me to give this talk to you. So the Stereo experiment in itself was designed to address two anomalies in the field of reactor antineutrino physics. So the first anomaly is actually a flux anomaly, also known as the RAA, for reactor antineutrino anomaly. So in 2011, there was a revised prediction for the antineutrino spectrum from reactors. And the comparison between the predicted antineutrino flux and the flux measured by several reactor experiments featured a 6.5% deficit at short baseline, which means at short distance from reactor core, usually a few tenths of meters. And as we can see on this figure, this deficit cannot be explained with the traditional free flavor oscillating pattern of neutrinos. So that is featured here in gray dashed line. But it might be described with a 3+1 flavor oscillating pattern featured here in plain orange line with these best fit oscillation parameters. So in this new picture, the additional state will necessarily be sterile. So in short, this flux anomaly might be interpreted as a signature of the oscillation of the neutrinos to a new and sterile state, and this is what Stereo aims at investigating. The second anomaly is a shape anomaly. So as we can see here, the comparison is now carried out on the spectrum shape with respect to the predicted shape. So this comparison features a 10% local event excess around 5 MeV that is yet to be explained. This anomaly is really distinct from the flux anomaly, as this event excess only accounts for roughly 1% of the overall antineutrino flux, to be compared with the 6% deficit of the measured antineutrino flux. So as these results were reported by experiments lowly enriched in uranium-5, with contributions from both uranium and plutonium isotopes to the overall antineutrino flux, one can raise the following questions. Does this deviation with respect to the model has something to do with the fuel composition? And are uranium and plutonium contributions to the shape anomaly comparable? So in this regard, as we will see below, the Stereo experiments brings a complementary picture to these results, as it is an experiment highly enriched in uranium-5, which is almost the only contributor to the overall antineutrino flux. How is this experiment designed? So Stereo is a ground-level experiment that operates in Institut Langevin, or ILL, in France. And it consists of a detector placed at short baseline at approximately 10 meters from a compact reactor core highly enriched in uranium-5 at 93% level, so that most of the antineutrino flux comes from U5 fissions. In itself, the detector is segmented in 6 cells, surrounded by 4 gamma catches. The 6 cells are for the oscillation analysis and correspond to different baselines on which Stereo aims at detecting the unfold of the neutrino oscillation. The background mitigation and rejection in Stereo is ensured via several layers of shielding, namely lead, polyethylene, and B4C, as well as a water shrink of muon veto, which, when combined to the pulse-shape discrimination capability of the experiment, enables to achieve a signal-to-background ratio of 0.8. As for the detector response, it is monitored with calibration campaigns on a weekly basis. They consist of point-like radioactive sources introduced in the detector target volume. On top of these data, the continuous cosmogenic boron spectrum is extracted and allowed to better constrain the energy scale of the experiment through a global fit procedure. So this is what is displayed in this figure right there. The top panel is featuring the calibration data, and the bottom panel features the boron 12 spectrum. So both figures compares data to Monte Carlo simulations, and as we see on the top panel, so the data to Monte Carlo residuals for the energy reconstruction is within the plus or minus 1% Bell band for all cells. So another key feature for the stereo experiment to mention is the enhanced understanding of the gadolinium gamma cascade from the use of the FIFO code, which is an improvement with respect to what was used before by stereo, so which is the Gen 4 physics list. And as we will see now in the next slide, this cascade plays a prominent role in the antineutrino signal extraction. Indeed, the antineutrino signal consists actually of prompt and delay signals induced by the inverse beta decay or IBD reaction. The prompt signal is a positron signal, which carries all the information on the antineutrino energy to be reconstructed. The delayed signal is the gamma cascade emitted in most cases by the de-excitation of a gadolinium nucleus after the capture of the IBD neutron. With this working detection process, stereo data taking features reactor on and reactor off periods, separated in two phases, phase 1 and phase 2. Of course, the reactor off periods are dedicated to background measurements, that is, to be subtracted to the actual signal. Both phases are used for the oscillation analysis, whereas only phase 2 is used for the shape and absolute rate analysis. But first, let me start with the results of the rate analysis. So the stereo absolute rate analysis reported in 2020 a deficit of antineutrino rate with respect to the Uber prediction of 5.2%. So the associated measured flux is most accurate measurement to date of the pure U5 antineutrino flux, and is compatible with the world average as we see here in this figure. So as I stated before, as an explanation to this deficit, stereo investigated the sterile neutrino hypothesis in its oscillation analysis. The principle is illustrated in this figure, where the bottom line is to search for relative distortions between the antineutrino spectra measured in each cell as a signature of the oscillation process. And so this is where, of course, the segmented design of the detector plays a crucial role to allow these relative comparisons between different baselines between cells. So in itself, the analysis has two key features. So it is shape only, meaning that it takes no input from the absolute antineutrino flux that I mentioned before and that was measured. And this analysis is as well prediction-free, meaning that it takes no input from any predicted shape, as we see with the shape anomaly that they are not fully reliable. So the point actually in this analysis is to find for each cell, for each measured spectrum of each cell, the best fit spectrum where the fitted parameters are in particular the oscillation parameters corresponding to different oscillation scenario. And the prediction-free analysis is ensured here by these phi-high, these free floating parameters, so one per energy bin, that are common for every cell. And in this chi-square rating, so all the systematic uncertainties are parameterized by nuisance parameters. So with this analysis, stereo could not reject the no oscillation hypothesis, but could reject the best fit point of the RAA at more than 99% confidence level. The approach that was used for the generation of these exclusion contours that we can see on this figure was a 2D delta chi-square approach, where the delta chi-square distributions were generated with Monte Carlo pseudo experiments. So this ensures a proper statistical treatment as the chi-square distribution involved here, so and are derived from the chi-square rating that I presented before, do not follow a standard chi-square law. So now let me show you the result of the last analysis carried out by stereo, which is the shape analysis. So more than only a shape analysis aiming at tackling the question, what about the shape anomaly, the goal was actually to provide a pure U5 antineutrino spectrum free of detector effects, and that could be used for comparisons to other experimental spectra or predictions. And to do so, we had to implement a deconvolution procedure to unfold the measured spectrum, so denoted here as D, in antineutrino energy spectrum, referred to as phi, using in the process the response matrix R that connects the measured energy space to the antineutrino energy space. And the main caveat to bear in mind when implementing such procedure is the deconvolution of the noise that may lead to non-physical spectrum shape. And to mitigate these effects, we relied on regularized unfolding techniques. In doing so, the price to pay is that it introduces potential bias in the unfolded spectrum that has to be well controlled. And this has been checked extensively by stereo by dedicated bias studies on thousands toy spectra that demonstrated that the biases were at the sub-percent level for spectral distortions like the 5 MeV bump. So to implement the unfolding procedure, stereo opted for a Tikhonov-like approach, consisting in the minimization of a regularized chi-square that is written right here. So this chi-square features two terms, where the first term covers the agreement to data and the second term governs the regularization. So as we saw before, in the first term, R is the response matrix, D the measure spectrum, and phi is the unfolded spectrum to be fitted. VD here is the experimental covariance matrix that encompasses the error budget of the experiments. That is summarized right here. And as we see in the stereo case, we are still statistics limited. In the second term, so this R1 term is a penalty term that penalizes high bin-to-bin fluctuations to mitigate the convolution of the noise. And with the addition of a prior shape spectrum that is set here to be in our approach the Uber spectrum, the Uber prediction, this regularization term introduces a class of short-range correlations that are the signature of the regularization and that mitigate the deconvolution of the noise. And the trade-off between the regularization and agreement to data is encoded by this R parameter, so this so-called regularization strength that is to be tuned. And of course, the higher R, the stronger the regularization. So with this Tikhonov-like procedure, stereo was able to unfold its measured antineutrino spectrum, that is displayed here on the left-hand side, in antineutrino energy range, displayed here on the right-hand side of the slide. And as expected, the correlation pattern of this unfolded spectrum exhibits some reasonable short-range correlations, mainly due to the regularization. So this unfolded spectrum has been compared to the Uber prediction. So as you can see on this figure, the ratio is displayed in the middle panel. And we see right here an event excess in the 5 MeV region that we quantified by applying a Gaussian fit on top of the baseline Uber prediction. And the amplitude of this bump was found to be 12.1% plus or minus 3.4%, thus featuring a 3.5 sigma local event excess. And however, with these numbers, stereo cannot distinguish yet between the U5 only and the equally shared between isotopes scenarios in the shape anomaly. So comes the idea to try to increase the physics reach of the experiments, and so this is what stereo tried to do by with a prospect experiment, which is another HEU experiment, and so both of these experiments initiated a joint effort aiming at producing a reference pure U5 antineutrino spectrum. So first of all, let me just briefly introduce you to the principle of the prospect experiment. So prospect is also highly enriched in U5 experiments, like stereo, and operates in the high flux isotope reactor facility at Oak Ridge National Laboratory. And like stereo, the detector is segmented and optimized for background suppression, even achieving a signal to background ratio of 1.4. In 2021, Prospect published its measured antineutrino spectrum, consisting of 50,000 IBD signal events. So the figure here features this measured spectrum. So those are the black points, and the overall model that includes the Uber prediction plus the several flux corrections. And so, like stereo, Prospect reported as well, with respect to this prediction, a local event excess. In their approach, this excess was quantified with respect to the excess reported by the diabetic experiments. So they treated a Gaussian bump at the position of the excess reported by Diabe and found the amplitude of their bump to be of 99% plus or minus 39% of the amplitude that was reported by the Diabe experiments. And as we see here on the error budget of the prospect experiments, like stereo, prospect is still statistics limited. So in the same fashion as before, the goal now is to implement a joint regularized unfolding procedure that would enable to produce a unique pure U5 spectrum from both stereo and prospect datasets. And in this regard, two approaches were considered. Stereo Tikhonov-like approach, so framework number one, which is the one that I detailed before, and prospect linear SVD filter approach, framework number two, which is a regularization routine optimized with respect to the signal to background ratio. And the two frameworks were used to produce the plots on the bottom of the slides, where stereo and prospect data are unfolded separately, meaning that in those two plots, so those are just stereo data only here and prospect data only unfoldings. And so the main conclusion that can be drawn from these two plots is that both frameworks produce consistent results with each other. And please let me emphasize the fact that these results are still preliminary and this is an ongoing work. Now, if one picks up one specific framework, say the Tikhonov approach, and compares the stereo data only unfolding to the prospect data only unfolding, we get, so in the common unfolding range of stereo and prospect, a satisfactory chi-square particular freedom between the stereo unfolded spectrum and the prospect unfolded spectrum. And this proves that both datasets are statistically compatible, which justifies a joint unfolding. Once again, let me emphasize that these results are preliminary. And so in the Tikhonov approach, the extension to a joint fit is quite trivial. So as you see right here, it just amounts to adding another contribution to the regular chi-square writing, where this contribution actually features the contribution coming from the prospect data set. And so doing so, we get this kind of result for the joint fit, where you see that this blue joint fit is actually between the stereo data only and prospect data only unfoldings as we would expect. And so stereo and prospect will provide to the community this joint pure U5 antineutrino spectrum, and to allow model comparisons free of unfolding bias, the filter matrix of the unfolding will be provided as well. So what is this matrix? Actually, the term filter comes from the fact that it is derived from the linear SVD filter approach, but it can as well be expressed in the Tikhonov-like approach. And this matrix encodes all the smoothing and all the bias induced by the unfolding regularization, may it be Tikhonov-like or linear SVD-like, so that we can correct from these effects when making comparisons to model. So allow me to summarize now. So what we saw is that stereo results provide a complete study of the reactor anomaly. The pure U5 absolute rate has been measured and is today the most accurate measurement. And it is consistent with the world average of other U5 flux measurements. The stereo oscillation analysis allowed to exclude the RAA base feed point at more than 99% confidence level. The shape analysis of the stereo unfolded spectrum featured a 3.5 sigma local event excess around 5.3 MeV, with respect to the Uber prediction, similarly to the excesses reported by lowly enriched in uranium experiments. But there is still some work to be done. The analysis of the stereo phase 3 data will enable to double the statistics and increase the sensitivity of the experiment for the oscillation analysis, as we can see on this figure. And as already mentioned, the ongoing work with the prospect experiment should also lead to a new pure U5 reference on a time spectrum. So stay tuned, please, and thank you for your attention.